conversations, whatever. Keep going. Okay, yeah. Get phone numbers, get digits, that's how magic happens. All right, so before we move on, I actually want to get a couple shout-outs. Why do you think it's important, as we begin to interrogate this idea of culture, why do you think it's important that we even begin reflecting on our own educational experiences? What does that bring to us? One or two responses. Essentially, what is the purpose of reflecting on our educational experiences before we begin discussing culture?
Oh, sorry. Alec, I think that our own educational experiences oftentimes dictate how we teach others and how we think education should be, and like for a lot of us, how we will then coach others to be teachers. I think if we're thinking really critically about our own educational experience, we can really think about, is my experience what's best for the kids today?
Yeah.
I think we can identify biases we don't realize we have. Like me looking through this, I'm like, yep, school is a good place for me. And then I'm thinking about my kids at my school. Nope, school's not such a great place for them. But sometimes I don't think we even realize our kids don't feel safe or don't speak the same languages. We're not even like aware of it unless we're critically thinking about our own story. Yeah.
For those of you who are maybe MTLDs in a Teach for America region, or for those of you who have just coached in any regard before, I think especially working with people who are coming straight out of college, what is one of the strongest points of feedback you have for them, right? Like, stop professing to your student. Like, your students don't need you to tell them 30 minutes of information to give them 15 minutes to like actually be learning, right? That's because that's what they know. That's their archetype, right, for what teaching is. I stand in front of my class, I eloquently articulate exactly what it is I want my students to take away, and then I give them this much time to actually work with the content, right? This is an important one, we'll come back to it over and over again, but it's essentially a pattern or model for how something is supposed to be. Education is supposed to be this way. Teachers are supposed to be this way. Students this way. Parents this way. Great, so we've begun to deconstruct our own, or really surface our own cultural values around education. Let's examine culture kind of in general as well. So when you think of culture, no need to like turn to a partner, but just share out, when I say the word culture, what comes to mind for you? Just words.
Norms and values.
Language, tradition, family, food, beliefs. Great. These are all true things, like all things I appreciate. Thank you very much. Right, so food and language and dance, and I hear country music is a thing. So music, like many things, right? And these are important components of culture. And don't misunderstand me here. I don't mean to suggest these things shouldn't be incorporated in the classroom. They absolutely should. My concern is people oftentimes begin here when this is actually this is not the roots of culture. These are important, right? But the roots of culture live within the perspectives, the values, and the behaviors of a group of people that impact how they learn. Can you incorporate different languages into your classroom and bring in food that reflects your students or doesn't reflect your students to kind of challenge their worldview on things? Can you bring in Garth Brooks? Sure. Can you, do relevant dances? Absolutely, but those are not the most critical things to consider when you're thinking about how to be responsive, right? So the perspectives, when I say perspective, based upon your students' families, their community's experience with school, what are their perspectives likely to be about school? Historically, what has school done for them? Has it been a conduit to opportunity? Has it been a conduit to nowhere? Has it been something more complex than that? That's what I primarily mean, and that's what is primarily meant by culturally responsive teaching. It's dangerous if we start here. Because if we start here, we actually miss the experiences of our students, and that's what we're fundamentally responding to. We're fundamentally responding to the experiences of our students that explain the perspectives they have about education. All right, so moving, now that we've surfaced our own cultural values around education, and we've begun to define culture, it's important for us to consider what cultural model has America infused into its schools. By and large, there's much research, and I encourage many of you to continue to learn about this idea if it's new to you. There's much research to suggest the banking model of education is the model of education that our schools are essentially founded upon, and that many, many schools, I would even contend most, still cling to. Can somebody just shout it out, read this quote to everybody, please?
An act of depositing in which the students, what, am I supposed to be doing this?
Yeah.
Just checking. An act of depositing.
I see Tasha reading.
An act of depositing in which the students are the depositors, did I say that right? And the teacher is the depositories, and the teacher is the depositor. Instead of communicating, the teacher presents and makes deposits that the students patiently receive, memorize, and repeat.
So for those of you who haven't had a chance to pick it up, I wholly recommend that you check out Pedagogy of the Oppressed. Paulo Freire, one of my personal heroes and one of the original theorists around education for justice, kind of defined this in his book, and this is where this quote came from. But if you can kind of imagine, what this looks like we've got our children, we've got our stuff, we just pour in stuff to our children, right? But I actually think I'm not the best articulator here. I'm gonna hand it to actually a friend of mine who put together a video to kind of highlight the banking model for us all to take a look at. So, Juan Carlos, take it away.
Part 1 of 3. What is educational excellence? The challenge the U.S. faces today is that the vast majority of our students are not excellently prepared for the workforce. From educators like Linda Darling Hammond to Geneva Gay, from authors like Tony Wagner to Thomas Friedman, and from corporations like Oracle to HP, they all agree we need to redefine educational excellence. Another way to say this is, what does it really mean to be smart? Traditionally, being smart means how much you know. To use a sports analogy of American football, the end zone would be equivalent to high school graduation. Students are working their way down the field trying to learn as much content as possible. When they've learned enough, they graduate, and we call this being smart. There are two problems with this traditional way of winning. First, in this country, we have an educational achievement gap to start with.
Or opportunity, yes.
Based on race, class, gender, immigration status, etc., students are starting on different parts of the playing field. For example, low-income students do not have access to a private SAT tutor, or immigrant students must first learn to master the English language before they learn the content. But even if the U.S. had closed the gap, we don't have the population compared to China or India to compete in this game. As many of you heard, they have more honor students than we have students, so we're never going to win. The second problem is that being smart is no longer just content knowledge, or in other words, just knowing stuff. The traditional educational approach has been like a drip system of knowledge that goes into a student who can later spew out answers on a standardized test. Like a tsunami, there is an overwhelming amount of information. We need a new game in the 21st century, for being smart is no longer how much you know, but how to navigate what is known. As a result of these two problems, we clearly have an educational crisis, because the rising tide of water is not affecting some of us, but rapidly drowning all of us.
So what are some of the Bloom's verbs that you would associate?
That's fine.
What are some of the Bloom's verbs you would just quickly shout them out, would you associate with the banking model of education? What are some verbs?
Recall. Factual recall procedure.
Identify, factual recall, describe, define. Yes, these things that essentially look like concrete pouring into our students' brains. Those are not the things that our students need most to navigate this world. What are some of the verbs then on the other side of the spectrum, right, that we would actually want for our students to engage with the most? Shout those out. Yes, it pains me. I work, like I mentioned, in the Bay region. I go to a lot of classrooms, and I love our core members up there, and we're all learning a lot. It pains me to go to a classroom consistently and still see 80% of the thinking happening down here. And there's a variety of explanations. Sometimes it's like skill, sometimes it's, do I actually think my students can do it? It's a variety of stuff. But regardless, it ends up being mostly this stuff. Sorry, I'm neglecting this side. I'm not being very equitable, my bad. It ends up being this stuff. We need to disrupt this stuff. because our students don't need it as much as they need this stuff. Great. So it's one thing to think about kind of banking absent, some kind of cultural dimension, but it's another thing entirely to think about what banking actually does in a context. So what we're going to do is take a couple of minutes to read a pretty tremendous, a little bit of a tremendous work that I would encourage you all to read in its entirety, called Subtractive Schooling from Angela Valenzuela. You can pop open your laptops again. It is handout number 2. It specifically details Valenzuela's work investigating what banking model has done to a specific set of Mexican American students in Houston at a high school. So go ahead and take 5 minutes. I do want to preface, it's quite like academic and kind of erudite. So for those of you who have been disconnected from academia, it's going to be like, whoa, this is academia again. But don't get hung up on that stuff. Get hung up instead on the major issues that she raises.